and start webinar soon. Good luck, everyone.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the.
Hold on, Rob, not yet. Sorry,
Oh.
hold on. I'm just going to share the screen first.
And you know what? Hey, I'm not.
Yeah.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this panel on living with water, amplifying community voices to drive adaptation to chronic flooding. Just a couple of quick logistic reminders for everybody. As we're hoping we have a terrific panel and conversation, but we are hoping to have some questions from the audience. You can pose them in the Q&A part of your Whova platform. If you're having technical issues or if you have sort of general questions about the conference, please put those in the chat and we'll be fielding those questions and directing them to our moderator. You can also find some community, you can look to the community board for additional sharing. And we also have a series of videos, including a number on climate change in the video gallery. If you need technical help during the session, the first thing that usually works for folks is just refreshing your browser, and that should get you back on board. But if you still have problems, just put a question in the chat and either Emma or Elizabeth will be able to help you out to get back on board. So with that, let me introduce our great moderator for this morning's session. Dan Wiley is the district director for Southwest Brooklyn for Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez. And I can tell you from personal experience, both Dan and his boss are incredible leaders when it comes to community resiliency, community amenity, and making the lives of the residents of Brooklyn better. And so Dan, I can't think of anybody better to help guide us through this morning's conversation than Dan. Dan, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Rob. So at the outset, just wanted to let everyone know the session is being recorded, and we have a great lineup of presenters on the panel. And just really quickly, we have Roger Gendron, who's president of the New Hamilton Beach Civic Association in Queens, Lindsey Campbell, research scientist at the U.S. Forest Service and the New York City Urban Field Station, and Drew Curtis, Senior Equitable Development Manager at Ironbound Community Corporation in New Jersey, just across the river, and Rebecca Fishman, Senior Policy Advisor for Waterfront Resiliency, New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. This panel, we have goals of better understanding the nature and impact of chronic flooding on local communities, and learning about research techniques for using community stories as data to inform policy and management. And we hope to get an overview of state and local policy context and opportunities for addressing the issue going forward. So with that, I'll just give a little opening presentation here. Sorry about that. All right. Does that look good?
Looks great, Dan.
Great. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what I'm dealing with in our district. I work for Congresswoman Velázquez, and we have 3 boroughs in the district that includes Lower East Side, North Brooklyn, going out to Queens, and also Southwest Brooklyn that I cover. And the Red Hook is an area that is mostly landfill and floods a lot. And so I figured we'd hone in on that. But we do have Superfund sites in Newtown Creek, which got redistricted. So our district lines changed from green to the kind of purple blue since 2012. I worked with Congresswoman for 20 years though. So we have Newtown Creek and Gowanus Canal and Wolf Outports. We actually have 3 Superfund sites in the district. This is Red Hook showing the surge and the pulse event we call Superstorm Sandy on the Red Hook Peninsula. And there was a series of projects to engage communities through the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program through the governor's office. And these are just a few examples of engagement. Rob was also with RPA, so they had a Sandy Regional Assembly as well. The New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program, I know a lot of people are familiar with it. It was a good idea to use community development block grant money for figuring out priorities for projects that communities wanted to see. And this kind of shows you a little bit of a process. I thought I'd go to 2014 during that planning process when the Red Hook Planning Committee was working with a lot of consultants. And among a lot of the risks that they were looking at were flooding and drainage in particular. After the storm and the surge, NYCHA, New York City Public Housing Authority, was pumping out basements, but they kept filling back in because of the high water table and water inundating back. So drainage is a huge problem in a waterfront community that's mostly landfill. 311 was a process, obviously, to get the City Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, that handles the sewers, to look at drainage issues and problem spots. And using 311 as a tool is one way for communities to register complaints. And looking at different kinds of backup, there's sewage backup complaints shown on this kind of heat map from 311 data. Clogged catch basins, and street flooding, good old street flooding, and combining those together to look at the different areas where we have the different kinds. The Red Hook committee put together with consultants kind of a tool to get people to look at the different kinds of flooding that they would see in their community, and actually identify the different types by observation and filling out and explaining what they actually see, and came up with a kind of a decision matrix to look at possible causes to try to identify what are some infrastructure projects to address the kind of recurrent flooding that happens. Sandy, of course, was a catalyst for looking at the flooding and other problems, but they certainly weren't confined just to the extreme weather event of a hurricane hitting. And this is showing the sewer through the New York City map and capital projects. And here I've overlaid on that New York City map the Ratzer map from the 18th century, which shows how there was originally a wetland and an island, which happens to be where there is a high ground actually in Red Hook, where an island used to be. So drainage, also has to do with historical as well as the built sewer system and the way the landfill happens. These are showing different elevations. At the end of the program, they came up with 9 priority projects, one of which was a drainage study for Red Hook to analyze the conditions of frequent flooding and look at possible solutions. And this was in 2014. Fast forward to today, after the Gowanus rezoning, one of the things that was leveraged was a cloudburst study for Red Hook and Gowanus. Gowanus Canal and Red Hook are close to each other and part of the same waterfront. So that study is going to be happening now as part of the cloudburst. And this last slide is just showing you, besides the fact that water is a challenge, it's also an opportunity, and that there are all kinds of different uses and different kind of structures on the waterfront, from the container terminal to a Brooklyn waterfront greenway, working waterfront, and also recreation. So all kinds of different uses that have to be overlaid on the problems. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. All right. And I think I stayed within my time, hopefully. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, who will be Roger Gendron. And Roger is president of the New Hamilton Beach Civic Association. In the aftermath of Sandy, Roger helped to coordinate local relief, neighborhood door-to-door surveys, and coordinated workshops for area residents with FEMA, rapid repair, and Build It Back programs. It was also part of the New York State Community Rising Committee for Howard Beach. The same kind of group that I mentioned in Red Hook, of course, is scattered throughout the state. And even prior to Sandy, Roger had been documenting flooding issues in his own neighborhood, sending them to NOAA to better determine coastal flooding benchmarks. And this work aligned nicely with the New York City Community Flood Project, run by the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which he started a collaboration with. So let's hear more from Roger.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everyone. As Dan said, my name is Roger Gendron. I've been the president of the New Hamilton Beach Civic Association since February of 2012, 8 months prior to the devastation that Sandy caused in my neighborhood and neighborhoods throughout the city and the state and the country. I do have a couple of things. How many attending today have ever been late or had to miss work or miss an appointment because of flooding? How many of your children were either late for school or had to miss the day because the streets were flooded and buses couldn't get through? Or how about scheduling a delivery or even planning a party, all based on the tide chart? Has anyone ever been awakened to a phone call and heard the words, "The tide's coming in, you better move your car"? I can answer yes to all these questions. You know, if you live anywhere near the coast, the risk of king or spring tides and of course storm-driven coastal flooding is always on your mind. However, it's not just during a storm event such as a nor'easter or a hurricane that causes our community's concerns. Tidal flooding from normal full or new moon high tides, which in the past occurred a few times each year, now can happen once, twice, 3 times or more each month. And an even bigger concern many communities have been experiencing is the increase in sunny day flooding. It's become a major issue for so many throughout the world. For my community of Hamilton Beach and Howard Beach, tidal flooding is starting to become the norm. Everybody has a routine, whether it's moving your car to an area that usually doesn't flood, to leaving your house sometimes more than an hour before you normally would, to make sure you get out for work or get the kids to school or food shopping or whatever the reason. If garbage is scheduled for a pickup and it's flooded, you can't put your pails out, they could float away. You know, the list goes on. And there are also many dangers that our community faces. Hamilton Beach has a pedestrian bridge, which you can see behind me, that crosses over Hawtree Basin, and a walkway that runs along the A-train subway tracks, which leads you to and from the Howard Beach train station. Those areas are often the first to flood at the end of or the beginning of each one of those walkways. We also only have one road in and one road out. And that same road needs to be used by any type of emergency vehicle that needs to respond to our area. And we do get a high tide and we have street flooding. Intersections that are used to enter Hamilton Beach are underwater. Drivers are often forced to travel in the wrong direction on a one-way street to avoid the worst of the flooding. And as flooding increases, so does the frustration levels of our residents. But most residents have grown accustomed to the problem. It's still a problem. So our Civic Association has a Facebook page, and what would happen is after any type of flooding event, the page would be overrun with photos showing the flooding in our streets. We knew it was important to document these events, but all the photos made the page a little difficult to navigate if you were looking for anything else. So in March of 2018, after a series of nor'easters the prior 3 months, I created the Hamilton Beach, Howard Beach high tide picture page. The page was created with the sole purpose of documenting the increased tidal flooding this community has been experiencing in the recent years. And since we started, we have over 700 pictures and videos uploaded and over 900 members on the page. And we asked those who post to include the date, the time, the location, and the approximate height of the water. And some of these pictures are sent to NOAA, who we hope they can use our local knowledge to improve forecast and models. So while our community was engaged in documenting our flooding, I was put in touch with the Science and Resiliency Institute of Jamaica Bay, as they were following the same thought process and were in the early stages of the New York City Community Flood Watch Project. Community Flood Watch Project is a growing network of residents and organizations who report local flooding and share experiences related to flooding in New York City's coastal communities. Researchers can use these reports to visualize how a normal high tide could look in the future due to sea level rise and to improve forecast of flooding and coastal hazards. Residents know more than anyone else about the flooding in their own neighborhoods. Both Flood Watch as well as the high tide photo page are just two examples of using local flooding knowledge to inform scientists so they can provide more accurate information. And the hope is that the data collected could help governments make better informed decisions about flooding. Going forward, however, a key factor would be giving these same communities and their residents a seat at the table with every discussion of flooding and its effect on those same communities, as well as mitigation plans to help curb the flooding. Climate change, which could result in the emergence of stronger natural disasters similar to Sandy, will bring more frequent extreme incidences that are likely to cause substantial damage to our area. The persistent tidal flooding our community has experienced over the last 20 years has only increased. The flooding has damaged local businesses, and residents are concerned about recurring flooding resulting in and ultimately causing local businesses to close. However, it's not just the physical damage that's our concern. There are well-documented patterns of mental health issues post-disaster. Researchers indicated that disaster-related displacement, relocation, loss of property, and personal finances are risk factors for mental health problems such as PTSD and depression. But the mental health effects do not stop there. The anxiety levels of the residents of my neighborhood that they feel when any type of coastal flooding is forecast is extremely high. Everyone's worst nightmare is to once again face the sadness they felt when they were throwing away so much after Sandy, including cherished memories and treasured keepsakes. One of the major risks for all coastal communities is sea level rise. It's evident by the increase in coastal flooding throughout the world. New York has experienced at least a foot of sea level rise since 1900. By 2100, some scientists project sea levels along New York's coastlines could be 18 to 50 inches or higher than today. This will drastically affect millions of residents, as New York's coastal areas are home to more than half of the New Yorkers. The increase in storm intensity and frequency that climate change can bring are already beginning to be witnessed just by looking at this past weekend when 4 confirmed tornadoes touched down on Long Island. And coastal communities will face challenges as they prepare for the effects of sea level rise. To address some of these challenges, a citizens project like New York City Flood Watch Project can use local knowledge of residents to help understand what areas flood first, the height of the flooding, and how long the flooding lasts. Sea levels are rising, storms are intensifying, and coastal flooding much more frequently. If the goal is to help coastal communities gather data to understand their risks and begin to identify priorities for building resiliency, then the voices of those communities directly affected by flooding need not just to be heard, but to listen to. We want to control our own destiny. We do not want to be a victim to our own destiny. Thank you.
Dan, you're on mute.
Yes, thanks, Roger. Appreciate hearing about the challenges and the human toll. That's a good transition now to Lindsey Campbell, who's a research social scientist at the U.S. Forest Service New York City Field Station, Urban Field Station. And Lindsay's research explores the dynamics of environmental governance, civic engagement, and natural resource stewardship. And she's co-author of Living with Water, documenting lived experience and social emotional impacts of chronic flooding for local adaptation planning, covering 2 communities participating in Flood Watch, which is Old Howard Beach, Hamilton Beach, as we've heard about from Roger in Queens, and also the eastern side of the Rockaways in Queens. So, Lindsay?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Dan and Roger, for the opportunity to speak on the panel. Just a quick bit of introduction about the Forest Service in New York City for folks that don't know. We don't own or manage any land here, but we are system scientists who work in research and development, who work in partnership with land managers and decision makers like at the City of New York, as well as with university partners and civic groups. And our goal is really to understand the city as a social ecological system. So I'm presenting on behalf of this collaborative team you see here on the slide, including my co-authors. And I'll just share a bit about how we use qualitative methods from social science to elicit those sorts of social impacts that you just heard from Roger. So you'll hear some repetition, but pattern and repetition are important to social scientists. So this is a pilot study that I will share from today. Just a quick definition on terms. In our paper, we use the term sunny day flooding that you heard Roger just use, and that's nuisance flooding that is minor or recurrent that occurs at high tide without storms or heavy rain. But chronic flooding can come from heavy rain, high tide, overtaxed infrastructure, and I'll be using that broader term today for chronic flooding. So chronic flooding, while maybe not as visible in the media as those extreme events like Hurricane Sandy or Ida, clearly has impacts on residents. You just heard from Roger. These are screenshots from that Facebook page that Roger referenced. And we know these repeated chronic disturbances are occurring and growing with sea level rise and increased precipitation. The question that drives me as a social scientist is how can we understand and capture the impacts of those chronic events? Flood Watch, what is it? It's a collaborative community science project that works with residents to record flood events and develop a baseline record of that flooding. It trains residents to document and report flooding using a standardized form, and it includes information about the location, date, time, duration, depth, impacts, and source of flooding. And I will drop some links when I'm not screen sharing so folks can check out the website. So it's really producing novel baseline data for New York City's most flood-prone coastal areas. Why should we collect community data? This community science tells us more information about where flooding is happening right now, the frequency of that flooding, a bit more about potential sources, and as we move into the social science research, a bit more about how residents perceive and experience those impacts. So with this pilot social impact study, we wanted to answer these research questions. What are the social impacts of living with chronic flooding? How can we use qualitative methods to capture both subtle and sustained changes and impacts? And how are communities already adapting to living with water? And what further adaptation strategies can the city and community use to best limit negative impacts? So this pilot started in the first 2 communities where Floodwatch was active, Hamilton Beach, Howard Beach, and Far Rockaway. We used in-person semi-structured interviews with community Floodwatch participants that were voluntary, confidential, recorded, and transcribed. We also had paper maps where respondents could use to sort of jog their memory or mark locations where they had directly observed or experienced chronic flooding. And because we were doing this in winter of 2020, right before COVID, larger planned in-person focus groups were not held, but certainly could be held with a similar protocol. So now I'll turn to the main findings of the study, which we group under these 4 themes: flooding observations and local ecological knowledge, social impacts, personal adaptations, and community connectedness and civic engagement. So this map shows aggregated observations of chronic flooding in Hamilton Beach, Howard Beach. These observations could be drawn as points, lines, or polygons on the paper map, which are then digitized in a GIS. Folks could clearly identify hot spots of flooding, both directly along shorelines, but also at inland locations. Folks had seen flooding on residential and commercial streets, and also near commuter subway stations in Far Rockaway. They took note of the roadways that persistently flood, areas where they need to move their cars to avoid damage, and places where they had needed to change routes or, redirect their vehicle. Similar map for Far Rockaway. But as you look at these spatial patterns, I want to emphasize this is a pilot study. You would want to do further outreach to sort of capture all of the observations citywide. But you could also imagine how these community generated maps could be layered together with 311 data like Dan showed, with the actual flood watch observations themselves. I think these data are most powerful when they're triangulated against each other. And also, I'll mention that this is a static map, but imagine an interactive tool where you could click on a place and actually hear the stories or see the images of the flooding from that place. I think that's a next frontier for really communicating about our places. But all of these observations and stories really reflect this honed local ecological knowledge that residents have about their place. Respondents talked about paying attention to lunar cycles, tide charts, and planning and adapting their practices accordingly. And they not only take in this information, they share it with family, friends, and their community through in-person and virtual communication that is locally accessible and trusted, which I think is really crucial to adapting to living with water. One of the main goals of the mayor's office in partnering in this research was to identify a roster of social impacts and a roster of adaptations that residents are making in order to identify, describe, and contextualize these impacts to inform adaptation planning. So this shows the rank order of those impacts, ranging from emotional distress to missed school and work appointments, to less frequently mentioned impacts like damaged vehicles and infrastructure. So the roster kind of sorts and aggregates these impacts, but the stories reveal the lived experience and emotional toll of chronic flooding and associated disruptions, such as canceling a planned family Christmas gathering, feeling unsafe or vulnerable in one's own community, or watching school kids have to walk on a wooden plank to board a school bus, raising clear issues about safety and accessibility. Overall, sunny day flooding was described more as a chronic nuisance or a hardship, and it was contrasted with those more extreme events like Hurricane Sandy that creates damage to property, to livelihoods. And there was no singular event that had the same impact as Hurricane Sandy, but the accumulated over time toll of these disruptions and missed events has clearly taken an emotional toll. Emotions expressed include fear, anxiety, nervousness, frustration over challenges in mobility, damages to property, and potential danger to self, families, and neighbors. Respondents also reflected on how those risks and impacts aren't experienced evenly. Vulnerable populations such as seniors living alone, people with underlying health conditions or for whom mobility is impacted, that rely on assistive devices or require electricity or require access to medication. All of those folks are more acutely affected by these regular flood events. Moving on to personal adaptations, same idea with the roster here in rank order. These most frequently include changing travel routes and times, moving cars to avoid flooding, but also things like selling homes or using sump pumps. So they range in intensity from changing your behavior to making different consumer choices like buying a high clearance vehicle to longer term investments around planning and housing choice. So we can start to unpack some of those examples, this regular everyday practice of having to move your car or change your travel plans, but we can see the way these even small changes have implications of lost time, hidden costs, disruption to routine, and challenges in planning. And I want to emphasize that this study didn't focus on coastal retreat or long-term adaptation, but we did ask people about their future visions, where they saw themselves in 10 years. And many said, I see myself still here in my community. I want to remain where I am in place. Others reflected that they might make different choices than they had in the past. They might encourage people not to move to their community or not to purchase property there. And others reflected on the flood risk exposure in their neighborhoods combined with the crisis of affordability citywide that was really creating a high pressure situation. Our final theme was about sense of place, community connectiveness, and civic engagement. These respondents are deeply rooted in their communities, many as lifelong and some multi-generational residents in a particular place. So these Flood Watch participants are civically engaged. They're in civic associations, stewardship groups, and they are growing the social networks that make neighborhoods strong. So a real question for leaders and decision makers is, how do we recognize and amplify and really engage that civic capacity? And how do we address unevenness where some neighborhoods might have more resources or more institutional infrastructure than others? So in sum, my last two slides here, community science can provide baseline data about where, when flooding is happening, but social impacts research and qualitative methods can tell us more about how residents perceive and experience that flooding. And this work is important not only for the data it produces, but the process it takes. Roger mentioned having a seat at the table. I think that co-production between research, government, and residents is the way to go. It acknowledges the lived experience of those residents and brings them directly into the adaptation planning process. I'll drop these links in the chat if folks want to read the paper directly that we published, and we're working on expanding this from a pilot to a larger study going forward. Thanks to my collaborators. I see Dan, so I think I'm out of time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lindsay. That's great. We're now going to move on to Drew Curtis. Sorry for saying you're across the river. We're across the river, I guess. Depends on your point of view. Drew is the Senior Equitable Development Manager at the Ironbound Community Corporation, where he served for the past decade as a community organizer and public policy advocate, leading neighborhood planning and revitalization and environmental justice and housing justice initiatives. And his work is grounded in principles of justice and equity, and they have the Passaic River. Drew, on to you.
Thank you, Dan. And yeah, it's actually I think 4 rivers between Brooklyn and Newark too. So there's a few, depending which way you're going to.
I stand corrected.
But thanks to everyone for being here. I've already seen so many parallels in the work that we're doing in Newark versus the rest of our region. So let me just pull this up. Again, my name is Drew Curtis. I'm with Ironbound Community Corporation. We are a 52-year-old multi-service community-based organization, really rooted in the grassroots since our founding, where single moms came together to found a preschool when they needed to go back to work. And some of the parents were able to work there, and others had their kids there so they could work elsewhere. And we've really continued that tradition throughout our history, working with residents, identifying neighborhood needs and issues, and then developing together, working to develop solutions too. So that's really cut through all of our challenges, all of our work too. Like our neighborhood makes up most of the East Ward of Newark. So it's about 55,000 people, predominantly an immigrant community. Right now, the largest countries of origin are Brazil and Ecuador. And Ironbound also has the state's largest concentration of undocumented families and individuals too. We also, our main zip code 07105 has the unfortunate distinction about being one of the most polluted zip codes in America, which includes the Diamond Alkali Superfund site in the lower 8 miles of the Passaic River, which is contaminated with dioxin, the active ingredient Agent Orange, New Jersey's largest garbage incinerator, Passaic Valley Sewage Commission, which is the largest wastewater treatment plant on the East Coast, the Port of Newark, which is the 2nd largest in the country, trucks going in and out, etc. Over 150 brownfield sites, numerous warehouses, fat rendering plants, 2 natural gas power plants with plans to build a 3rd. Hopefully we are able to stop that on a side note, but yeah, this is kind of the environment that we're operating in too. And this is just another map that kind of just shows most of Ironbound for context. You can see the Amtrak line on the left side of your screens there. And that really balanced us in too. And at one time, Newark had it upgraded their zoning ordinance. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Newark hadn't upgraded their zoning ordinance in over 50 years. So Ironbound, we developed in 2001, we developed our own master plan too, to try to get ahead of that and stop the encroach of residential homes into industrial areas too, which definitely led to some housing, to more health issues too. But sorry, there was just an issue. Let me try again. Sorry about this, y'all. Why is this not going up into?
Drew, do you maybe
I think
want to
we-
try the bottom? There
Here we go.
We got it.
Yeah, that was weird. But we're talking about flooding today. So our neighborhood, on top of all the other environmental justice issues, deals with massive, just everyday flooding. Anytime it rains, the streets look like this too. Or this. Or this. There's a gentleman who's has his fishing rod out, because what else are you gonna do when you can't go to work or to school or out till you stay at home and do some fishing too. So what's causing all these issues? Combined sewer overflows too. So like a lot of communities, Newark has mostly a combined sewer system where the sanitary sewer and the stormwater sewer ends up in the same pipe. So when it rains, there's no place for it to go. And over the past couple of years, we worked very closely with the city of Newark to develop a long-term control plan to comply with the state permit, but also to address these flooding issues too. It was an urgent need. Our community was telling us this. We needed to get it done. So we were able to leverage some philanthropic dollars, and we hosted about 28 meetings all told, with about over 750 attendees. And they were all hosted by community groups, people based in the different wards of Newark, in the different neighborhoods too. And then the report was then submitted to the city of Newark for inclusion in the long-term control plan. ICC, we were the lead organization, and we delivered a PowerPoint deck, sample outreach flyers, facilitator guides, a small group discussion poster to the other community groups in the other parts of the city too. So they were able to do the same community engagement too. A sample agenda, 6:30 arrival and sign in, start and by 6:45 with a quick presentation, and then leave most of your time for small group discussions. Give yourself a full hour. And then we come back around 8:10 for our closing and report backs, talk about next steps, and a raffle too. Get people engaged too by raffling something off. And so to get people engaged in this, make it fun, have some music playing, offer dinner. I think we called a lot of our events community dinners and shares, and have that raffle, have some giveaways too. Listen more than you talk. That's kind of community organizing 101, but we have to say it. Make it accessible. For us, that really meant having the meeting in 3 languages, and we used headsets for English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And stay on time too. Geez. Sorry, it did it again. So sample flyers that we used, all trilingual. This was what the poster looked like that we had big copies of that people got to write on, etc. And then we talked about the different alternatives and we tried to make them as simple as possible too. A little video of Passaic Valley Sewage Commission. Those open pits, as the kids in our neighborhood call it, the poop factory. And of course, we talked about some other alternatives too, for at the individual or the community level as well. So we're just about wrapped up right now. I know I'm close to my time, but just to share like what we learned, and I think is really, really important to highlight. It kind of takes after the old environmental justice saying, those most impacted must lead, and the community are the experts. That's really the case here too. The residents are the ones who know what the issues are. They see them on a daily basis anytime these issues emerge. And it's just really, really important to follow their lead and make sure that they're at the table when these plans are happening. With the long-term control plan, residents wanted the issue fixed. They wanted this flooding to be abated or mitigated. And they knew it was going to cost money and would be disruptive. They were okay with that. They also said, let's go green whenever possible, and so we can get other benefits like addressing extreme heat and air quality. And so we moved forward, and we actually had a good win where we got there to be shared costs amongst all the municipalities and not just the CSO ones too, because everyone complies to it too. And we're applying these lessons right now in the Resilient NJ program, which is another planning effort that's using old community development block grant disaster recovery dollars from HUD that the state of New Jersey has left over to fund long-term resiliency planning. And so now Newark's working with Jersey City, Bayonne, and Hoboken. And we're really working to implement the or develop a regional plan too, because water doesn't know boundaries, so we can as well. And we're still applying these same approaches too. So hopefully folks can get involved. I'll drop the link in the chat as well. The next meeting is tomorrow. Thanks, y'all.
Great, thanks, Drew. That was great. As an environmental justice advocate, Eddie Bautista here in New York City would say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So good to hear about all your great engagement over there.
Eddie's great.
So now we're gonna go to our final, last but not least panelist, Rebecca Fishman, who's the Senior Policy Advisor for Waterfront Resiliency in the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. They added climate to their name. As a member of the Waterfront Resiliency team, Rebecca manages the design and implementation of several large coastal protection projects in Queens and Staten Island, and also a pilot sensor network called Flood Net. So Rebecca.
Thanks, Dan. And just also a shout out to Dan. He's been working really closely with our office for many years and has been sort of a tireless supporter for resiliency in Red Hook and Sunset Park and those neighborhoods who are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm. So thank you for all your advocacy and pushing us to work faster and harder for those local communities. So hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca. Some of what you'll hear has already been touched on, probably more eloquently by Lindsay and Roger, but I'm here to talk about the New York City Flood Watch program and then its sort of subsequent program, Flood Net. As Dan mentioned, I'm a senior policy advisor at the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, and we're actually back in the office full time. So I apologize for wearing a mask and if you can't hear me that well. Sorry. So why did we start Floodwatch, which is what we're calling a community science initiative? We noticed that high tides are already causing sewer surcharging and overland flooding. And as these sea levels continue to rise, the flooding will worsen. At this point, New York City does not have a streamlined data collection system or mapping platform to document this flooding. And some of the maps that we do have, like the New York City Panel on Climate Change, known as NPCC, there are sea level rise maps, and our new stormwater maps need on the ground validation. So every time we can collect data from streets about tidal flooding, that will help us calibrate our models. And we also understand that residents have unique insights into the timing, scale, and impacts of tidal flooding, as Roger has really gone into great detail on. So what are some of the impacts of sunny day flooding that we're seeing? We're seeing infrastructure damage. We're seeing impairment of city service delivery. So by city service delivery, we're talking about mail, we're talking about trash collection, we're talking about school buses, emergency response teams, so both NYPD, FDNY, and EMS. We're talking about mobility restrictions, so getting to work, getting to school, seeing friends and family, personal property damage. We're seeing basements getting flooded, first floors getting flooded, small businesses getting flooded, disruption of daily life, and health and safety concerns. So Floodwatches and FloodNet are really part of a multi-pronged sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding initiative, where we're trying to figure out how we engage with communities to better monitor urban street level flooding and provide actionable data and information to stakeholders. And so that includes Floodwatch, which Lindsay spoke about, the social impacts pilot study, Flood Net NYC, and also an improved risk communication. So how do we use the Floodwatch data? This Floodwatch data so far has been used in flood forums to educate residents on flood risk, flood endurance, and emergency preparedness. It can be used as an advocacy tool for communities to lobby the government, their elected officials, about how often and the scale and scope of this flooding. It identifies and shares flooding hotspots with relevant city agencies. So the Floodwatch data is shared with our Department of Transportation, our Department of Environmental Protection, our Department of Emergency Management, who can all better hone their services and mitigation measures based on this data. And it's also, importantly for this presentation, justified funding for a flood sensor pilot project called FloodNet. And so you can see here, it's a flood map viewer. So this is the current Survey 123 tool that Floodwatch uses. So folks who are participating in the program can enter in their information. It goes up on that map. And when you click on one of those dots, you'll see the information about the time of day, the source of flooding, the date and time, location, source of flooding, and then you can get a picture that you see to the right. So what is Flood Net NYC? It's a consortium of research institutions in partnership with New York City and local community organizations to design, build, and test, deploy low-cost, robust sensors to monitor hyperlocal street-level flooding. So what we want to do is develop a real-time dashboard to contextualize and communicate the data to a range of stakeholders. So these stakeholders could be city agencies, researchers who are interested in flooding events and modelers, and then also community residents who can use the information to do for emergency response and personal mitigation. So if they know it's about to flood or it's just started flooding, they can put out sandbags, they can move their valuables from the basements and kind of take other precautions. We want to provide quantitative, consistent data to inform future preparedness and emergency response and validate future flood models, as I mentioned before. We've started in 2 pilot neighborhoods with different flooding profiles, Hamilton Beach in Queens, in conjunction with Roger and the New Hamilton Civic Association, and in Gowanus, Brooklyn. We've also added 2 sensors in South Williamsburg, and we're planning a deployment in Red Hook by the end of November. With the new New York City funding, we're kind of sketching out a program to include 500 sensors over 5 years to cover both inland and coastal flooding. So here you can see the flood sensor data in Hamilton Beach from a winter flooding event. The circle shows where the flood sensor is, and then the two charts on how that flooding interacted with high tide. So you can see that high tide had a clear influence on the flooding. You can see our team here next to our sensor and how the sensor is kind of encased in a PVC pipe to help protect it from the elements there. And then here is the flood sensor data in Gowanus. We were able to capture two major flooding events over the summer, Tropical Storm Henri and the remnants of Hurricane Ida. The red circle is highlighting where the sensor is in Gowanus, and that would be at the Hoyt and 5th Street location. You can also start to see how different storms have different profiles. So in Tropical Storm Henri, there was actually two peaks where the water rose and fell and rose and fell. And then in Ida, there was one peak, but it was much more sustained. So it took a lot more time for the water to clear off the streets. You can also see the difference in the sensor design here. It's a much smaller sensor that's located higher up, but they both use the same ultrasonic technology to detect water on the street. In Gowanus, we also have a sensor over the Gowanus Canal to similarly track how high tide is influencing flooding. So in talking more about our data dashboard, our challenge is to make the data collected accessible and understandable to community groups, researchers, and city agencies. We want to display sensor locations, current readings, and temporal flooding events. We want to allow for commenting so there can be a robust conversation for folks living in the neighborhood about how flooding is impacting their lives, kind of sharing of mitigation and adaptations. We want the ability to include other data such as flood hazard layers, historical streams and wetlands, and meteorological data like rainfall, and 311 data, so complaints where people are already talking about flooding and reporting it to the government, and additional needs as surfaced through community stakeholder workshops. So those workshops are being planned right now and scheduled, and we hope to have them all done by around mid-December. And you can see to the right a draft mock site of what that real-time flood monitoring dashboard will look like. And all this is done thanks to a grant that we received from the New York Empire State Development Corporation. So another prong in our Sunny Day or nuisance flooding initiative is risk communication. So community science and flood sensor data help better define minor and moderate flood levels, thresholds, and micro scales. Mass emails for higher than normal high tide events are sent out to warn folks about flooding on the streets. And we're including new messaging about preparedness, including moving cars and avoiding floodwaters to avoid loss of life and loss of property. So you can see to the left, the Stevens Institute of Technology chart that we use that FloodWatch uses to send out to residents to warn of flooding, and a sample post on social media about the expected high tide events around Jamaica Bay. So another kind of aspect of our risk communication is a partnership between New York City Emergency Management and the National Weather Service. We are collecting impacts to inform forecasting and thresholds that Roger mentioned. So a lot of those pictures are being sent to the National Weather Service, and they're kind of honing their prediction. So if it's expected to be 5 inches over normal high tide, that could be a minor event in some places, but it could be a moderate or major event in other places, depending on elevations. And we're also adding preparedness language to coastal flooding warnings, watches, and statements. So you can see below kind of a new emergency alert text so that folks know that to avoid driving in the floodwaters, how important it is to move your car to higher ground. That's one thing that we learned in that special impact study, that a lot of folks are experiencing damages to their cars because of erosion or corrosion due to salt water. What are our next steps? For FloodWatch, we want to continue and grow, continue to grow and maintain community partnerships and involvement. So right now we're active in a bunch of neighborhoods throughout Jamaica Bay, including Coney Island, the Rockaways, Hamilton Beach, Broad Channel, and in the Bronx and City Island, and Edgewater Park and Throgs Neck, but we want to expand our reach as funding allows. The social impact study, we want to apply for grants to build from a pilot study to broader populations and geographies. For Flood Net NYC, we want to build and refine that data dashboard, expand the flood sensor network, design to manufacture those sensors. So how can we build those sensors at scale, and begin program building with the new funding, including long-term staffing. For risk communication, we want to continue to refine messaging and geographic customization so that folks can get the best forecasts as possible. On the city response side, begin to build a suite of short-term, low to medium cost approaches to relieve the impacts of living with water. Those approaches could be anything from signage, warning that the street often floods, to providing parking in high elevation areas, or other similar low cost, low capital interventions. So thank you all, and that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. So now we're gonna go on to a little moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. I think we've seen a lot of really good examples of tools for gathering community perspectives and voices to provide data and understanding that could drive planning and adaptation, or does it? How can we advance these tools? I mean, I think we've seen some good starts. How can we advance them to better drive planning and adaptation decisions? I can open it up to anyone who would like to chime in based on some of your colleagues' presentations and any cross-fertilization. And of course, we span different states. So it's interesting to me to see the parallels between what we're doing here and what's happening over in New Jersey. Since the tides and the estuary doesn't know the state border, I'm also curious how these efforts can be coordinated across the region.
Well, I'll just chime in with a couple thoughts, Dan. I mean, I think it's clear that there are these really powerful stories and lived experiences. They're out there. But when does a story become data? You know, how do we capture those stories at scale and treat them appropriately as the data that they are? I think that's really the challenge. And you've seen, you can use qualitative methods, you can use community organizing and engagement. I think there's ways to make community meetings more interactive and inclusive, like Drew has signaled. I think there's also the need to be doing this work in an ongoing cycle. Like, yes, it gets triggered by a funding stream or, you know, a capital project, but what about outside of that context? How can we build that trust and bring in community voice sort of over time and through time without fatiguing people? I think that's really the challenge, and really helping communities gather and share their own stories. So how can we take some of these methodologies and sort of turn the reins back over to communities? I have lots of thoughts about that from participatory action research. But last I'll say is, I think I mentioned this in my talk, that these streams of data are most powerful when they're triangulated. Like, you do need those incredible sensor networks that Rebecca's developing, but you need the engineering and the biophysical data about the floodplain, but you also need the stories of how it's impacting people's lives. So I think if we lean too far into one or the other, we miss the picture of the system, and the power is in joining them together.
Yeah, I guess yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, so one of the things Rebecca touched on was the flood net. So we also have a flood sensor over Hawtree Basin. And through the work through the Civic, what I do is whenever there's any type of coastal flood statement, advisory, warning, watch, of course I put it out to the neighborhood, and I try to simplify it so people understand, because, you know, it took me a while to learn all the vernacular going through National Weather Service's discussions when it came to tide and flooding. So, but I try to simplify it. But one of the things that's been a plus for us is having a flood sensor so close to my community, because for 30 days straight, I checked the results from that flood net, that flood sensor, with the results of the tide gauge at Bergen Basin, which is not here, it's on the other side of Hamilton Beach, up another canal, but it's in close proximity, and they are with 1/100th of an inch of each other. So what I can use is those numbers now. When I look and I go, they're calling, or Stevens is calling for a 2.5-foot storm surge at Bergen Basin, I'm pretty sure that we're going to see that same storm surge, and I can use the numbers from that tide gauge to actually put out alerts for my community. And I think that's great. I think these flood sensors should be everywhere, over the canals. You said there's one in Kiwanis. That's fantastic. And I just think moving forward, things like that are great. They really are. I mean, I think everybody's in this for the same reason. And at the end of the day, we just got to take everything and just package it and make it simple for people to understand. Very basic language, but still get the results that we hope we get.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have gotten that original funding to start the flood sensor network without all of the pictures. I think you said it was over 700, Roger, that kind of proved the need for these sensors. So if we didn't have that kind of wealth of community science data, couldn't have gotten our initial grants. And then once our pilot project proved that those sensors were really helpful, we now got additional funding to expand citywide. So it all, as Lindsay was saying, it all builds on each other, and it's kind of important to have the full story as we work towards adaptation.
Can I add in something? I think, Dan, you had asked about collaboration across borders. I think one really good example of how we've worked well in the past regionally, and how we still need to, is when we look at the flood maps that are coming. A few years ago, FEMA released their new flood maps for the first time in a long time, but the methodology wasn't great. And New York City, you all led the way in challenging them and pointing them out. I know Newark and a bunch of other Jersey municipalities signed on to them and forced FEMA to redo them. So that's happening right now. And I still think, though, they're still going to be worse, and more communities are going to be in flood zones. I think we're going to see that. But we need to make sure that when folks are getting flood insurance, it's not going to add another affordability challenge to folks who are barely getting by right now, either paying their own mortgage or property taxes, or for tenants, the landlord isn't going to pass on flood insurance taxes to tenants too. So we need to make sure that the subsidy remains in the National Flood Insurance Program. I know Senator Menendez recently introduced something to do just that. It's actually, I think it's bipartisan legislation. So that's something that I think we can work on together regionally and throughout the country.
Yeah, I think affordability is a huge issue with the rates going up, and a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of where the National Flood Insurance Program, the firms, as they're called, flood insurance rate maps, where they are, and I think maybe overlapping a lot of these things. It's interesting that those are looking at coastal flooding from surge and sea level rise, but then we had with the more recent event from the downpours, flooding happening in high ground that aren't on the waterfront and wouldn't be mapped into that new FEMA map, which, by the way, won't be finalized, I think, until 2024 or 25. So there's a long process of revising those maps. It'd be interesting to hear how the Fed and the city and the different municipalities are interacting on those. And it'd be interesting to hear what their methodology is and their data collection is, and how community input can actually have impact on what those flood insurance rate maps look like. Anyone want to comment on that? That's kind of getting into the weeds, I think, but.
Well, the other thing with flood insurance is now with this new risk 2.0, which nobody has any idea how this works. You think as they roll this out, FEMA and NFIP, there would have been someplace you can go in and go, oh, let me put my address in, right? FEMA had what's my BFE, so you can go in and find out what your base flood elevation is. Well, they should have the same thing. What's my flood insurance rate? And we've tried to tell other portions of Howard Beach who, according to the new maps, when they do come out, will be in a flood zone. They're not in a flood zone now. They don't have flood insurance. And we're trying to tell them, listen, buy it now. Don't wait until you have to. Buy it now. And we had discussions too, and how do we get this word out to like the residents of New York City? And we're saying, well, everybody gets the tax and finance property value evaluation in the mail. Put something in there. Put a little blurb in there saying, look, going in 2024, it's forecasted for new maps to come out, you will be in a flood zone. Just to get the word out so people understand that this is coming. You know, I had a meeting with 200 people in Howard Beach, and half of them were from New Howard Beach. They don't have flood insurance. And when I was explaining this to them, all I looked at was open jaws, because they were stunned that this was going to happen to them. They had no idea. And I think that's key too. So to communicate one-on-one with those homeowners, something that they get every month or every year, whether it's a tax bill or work with the utilities to put something in those bills, anything like that, just to get the word out, because people are going to be in for a shock. They really are going to be in for a shock.
Is it possible to create that kind of, I mean, already we're seeing these tools that have great potential that most people probably don't know about. Is there a way of administration, local administrations, putting this information out in a way that engages people? It's kind of a hot potato, and we kind of kick the can down the road and not thinking for a couple of years while the eggheads, you know, and the surveyors and everyone who's involved in looking at those kind of things, you know, it's very, very technical. But is there a way of communicating what's coming and engaging people with all these new sensors and community tools that are being developed? And I guess that's a yes or no question.
I know my community is aware of it because I make sure that they're aware of it. You know, again, we have 1,000 people on our regular Facebook page, 900 people on this picture page. And when there's a weather alert, I put it out on those. Any type of thing like this, I put it out there. Look, buy it. If you don't have it, buy it now. There's so many ways. But, you know, not everybody's on Facebook. There's 28,000 people in Howard Beach, and I have 1,000 of them that I talk to. And that's the folks that you have to get at, the ones that don't use social media. So something in the mail. They do it for flood zones, right? That'll come in something from the city, anything like that. And do a mass mailing. And this way they all know, hey, guess what? This is coming.
You know, nothing beats just paper and just going door to door and flyering and talking to folks too. It's the old fashioned method, works the best too for folks. Sometimes the mail doesn't even work too. So, or sometimes you can't find the right address. So if there are, I mean, I know there's plenty of studies about New York City about basement flooding and illegal basement apartments. Same thing in Newark after Ida. So can you even find the right address to drop something off in the mail? So it's really going out and talking to people too. Like when it goes back to data, you have to have that mix of like science-based, like quantitative data with like centers and so forth, with like the stories that Lindsay mentioned. And I think there's great ways you can do that with like story maps, etc., where you can visualize some of like the sensor data too, but then you can also have like links to someone telling their own story about how they're affected by it too. And I think, yeah.
I think on the communication front, you know, and information dissemination, obviously it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. You can't reach people the same way. I totally agree about mass mailing and door to door, but what our research has found is the importance of these civic brokers. You need the Rogers in every community informed and part of your communication plan. You need the Ironbound Community Corporation. So, you know, cities and municipalities have their own means, and, you know, the city's doing incredible work with things like Notify NYC, but it has to be this sort of both and approach. We have this incredible civic infrastructure in our city and region, and it's a matter of finding it, recognizing it, including in non-traditional places. It might not look the same in every community, and really sharing information across that boundary. And I know that Mayor's office and the social resiliency team has really been putting some thought to that. The Office of Emergency Management has been putting some thought to that, but it's like, how do we find these pockets of civic capacity, these brokers who are sort of key conduits to their communities that have that trust and can have that community meeting where people will show up, and it's not going to look the same in every single community. But I think that's got to be part of the overall strategy. You got to find the Drews and the Rogers who can help you find the other 500 to 5,000 people they're talking to.
Yeah, and I would just say that, after Sandy, I think it was a good use of community development block grant funds to give money to communities to engage and prioritize. And obviously we have a big infrastructure bill that's just signed into the law yesterday. And there is money for kind of resiliency response to the effects of climate change. There's also, of course, we want to get Build Back Better this week, please, but I don't know when. And, but I think, the social side of it is that people are as much part of infrastructure as physical infrastructure that's traditional. And that's key. So, I think, would it be a good idea to allocate resources to engage, to empower community engagement on the local level?
And Dan, that's one thing that we're seeing right now is before Hurricane Ida and Henri, there were projects that were being conceived of through all this nuisance flooding. So these chronic events help us design and build programs that may not have funding when we think of them and when we design them, but if there's a big storm that comes and there's more federal funding, or if there's a big infrastructure bill, as you mentioned, or the Build Back Better bill, like there's all opportunities to fund these programs if they're ready to go. And so that's one thing that we found with the Flood Center Network. We were just sort of waiting for funding to come in and it was ready to go. And that's been a great boon for our program. But I think there are other communities who are kind of like thinking through adaptation and kind of taking the next step and designing programs to help increase their flood resilience and be ready to go for when that money does come in would be really helpful. And it's kind of the next step that my office is taking right now.
That's great. Also, I just wanted to hit on like community engagement overall, like something that Resilient New Jersey, the HUD program that that's funding the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to develop these regional resilience plans. When the DEP set that up, they were intentional, said you need to have community groups as part of your core team to drive community engagement, and don't make community engagement an afterthought. That's something that I think should just become a best practice standard across government overall. Like, treat community engagement with just as much vigor or importance as like engineering costs or whatever it may be, design costs, etc. too. Like, it's just as important, if not more important too, to make sure that like you're really getting at the real issues that are affecting folks too. It's something that we've said to our state DEP numerous times during the combined sewer overflow process too. You need to set aside funds directly to people who know how to do community engagement the right way, rather than having an engineer also trying to do community engagement. It's not what they've been trained in. It's not what their expertise is. Let's just make sure that folks who know how to do this are the ones doing it too. We were lucky during our long-term control plan process that we were able to leverage private philanthropic dollars. A lot of places, most places in the country, weren't able to do that too. But so if it just becomes ingrained in our public finance, I think it could just make all of these efforts a lot stronger.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have Superfund projects in our respective communities, and those have I think EPA has a very good model in the community advisory group that you have at Superfund sites. Some are more engaged than others, but they, it can be up to 50 people that meet regularly. And then there's kind of an intersect with the city when it comes to flood controls, and in the case of Gowanus, actually coming up with doing more than what was in the long-term control plan that the city had. So actually doing more in terms of water quality and coming up with more mechanisms to control sewer overflows and to monitor them more. So I think you have some overlap there, but it's great to see all sides stepping up. I guess the last question would be, how do we, and then we'll open up to the audience questions, but how do we avoid the danger of planning for the last storm? I guess we have so many storms. If we plan for the last storm, maybe it's okay because we have so many different types of calamities. But anyone want to say anything about that? This is always the question of, you get money after a particular pulse event, but then you have the recurrent event that isn't, the famous event, but it's like the regular event. It becomes the new normal, which actually is the title of a report that the city put out. So open up to anyone who wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of folks have said it, but I think these chronic events, extreme weather is going to become more every day. So if we can plan to address these chronic, minor, and moderate flooding issues, we'll be better prepared for the next pulse event. But of course, the pulse event is the focusing event. It's the policy window. It's when the resources start to flow. But I think Rebecca made the case that having done pilot work, baseline work, trust and relationship building, so that you're then poised to sort of make an ask when that policy window opens, that's the best that we can do right now. And I think along with that is we can't just focus on the particular disturbance of flood or heat. That's going to continue to change. We have to consider the social dimensions that are sort of underlying communities' abilities to respond, the sort of community capacity that exists, the social trust that exists in a place. That is a through line that's going to help get people through the extreme event. So again, sort of to Drew's point about investing in community engagement, we need to be investing in community capacity sort of at all times, before, during, and after the event. So I think it's going to continue to be these ongoing disruption and recovery cycles. And the question is, how best can we harness that sort of focusing event or policy window that follows an unfortunate extreme event?
All right, so I'll try to read a few questions that are coming from the audience. One question from Elsa Sheriff, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, is how do we convince insurance companies that flood insurance is necessary for residents not in flood zones? I just heard a story that while renters insurance is only about $150 a year, flood insurance can cost tenants upwards of $700, and they need to demand the coverage. That's a tough one.
Well, it's my understanding that you can purchase flood insurance wherever you live. You could be on the top of a mountain and purchase flood insurance. And the other issue that comes up now is they're no longer using, while they're using the maps to determine where your home is, Risk 2.0 uses proximity to a body of water and other factors to rate you for flood insurance. But you can never be denied flood insurance. And what I tell other people is, if your broker is saying, you don't need that, I would find another broker. Because if that's something that you want, you should just be able to go, I'm going to get flood insurance on this home. So dollars and cents wise, I'm not sure. I really don't, especially with the 2.0. But flood insurance is accessible to anybody. throughout the country. Especially if, if you fall in if you're in one of the I can't think of the term, the areas that FEMA covers, the NFIP covers.
Yeah, and just a side note, of course, that the private insurance company was not providing flood insurance, and that's why the federal government got into the role of creating a program for flood insurance. So there's kind of the whole risk question of what makes sense and doesn't make sense in terms of the market. Of course, flood insurance can be a whole conference unto itself. Anyone else want to chime in on questions of risk and insurance?
Yeah, so I would say in what we're called 100-year floodplain flood zones, recommend going to Flood Help New York. They're a great resource on all things flood insurance. And as part of the Extreme Weather Task Force report, the new normal, we have a new initiative where we're going to be going out and doing outreach to those inland areas that experience regular flooding and kind of educate folks about flood insurance, how to get it, how to make sure you're, work with good brokers, bringing in Flood Help New York. So that's an initiative that will begin. The city's just sort of shifting to all the risks. So, before, after Hurricane Sandy, we were very focused on making sure that folks in the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, get flood insurance. Now we're expanding the footprint to those places in New York City that experience regular flooding.
Okay. Now we also have some other questions. A question for Drew. Can you speak more about how meetings were set up in 3 languages? Were there any challenges with having meetings be trilingual, like with headsets or?
So this one, I'll just say technology is your friend. When you can purchase these headsets, and you just make sure you have someone who's a trained translator in whatever languages you need, and they get the master headset. And so as I'm presenting in English right now, the trained translator would be translating it simultaneously into Portuguese or Spanish in our community, or whatever languages you need. So it happens simultaneously too. So you just need to set up those logistical processes too, to have effective sign in and sign out too, and make sure you get everything back. Make sure you have resources dedicated for translation as well, so you can pay your translator too. That's a very important skill set, and we have to value that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've done, last 2 weeks ago we did a Zoom meeting about flooding and getting assistance, because the FEMA deadline from the last storm to apply for assistance is December 6th. So we did a town hall on Zoom, and the good thing about Zoom is you have these channels at the bottom, and you can just create language channels and get someone who can do the translation on a particular channel. And you just tell people at the outset to click on Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever it is, and then they can just be listening in real time through that particular channel. We also had someone who was restating my question. What is the community engagement that is needed, can be funded from the infrastructure bill or Build Back Better, so that residents can see the benefits of these infrastructure investments?
Well, you could probably speak to your own question, Dan, but every federal,
question,
well, every federal agency, it's a funding package, but every federal agency has its own, constraints and processes and requirements around their decision making, and they're not uniform. And that's the problem if you're a person on the ground just sort of living and you're being touched by the actions of all these agencies. Like Dan, you mentioned EPA's Superfund has a really strong community advisory sort of framework. By contrast, if you're, receiving FEMA funding to do coastal protection, it has, formal cost benefit frames that are going to drive the requirements for decision-making of what can be built. So some of this is about how can you work within the existing systems that exist? How can you make more transparent those sort of logics or governing structures? And how can we kind of across all of those agencies create more opportunities for meaningful engagement and diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think in parallel to these funding packages, an interesting initiative that maybe doesn't get as much press is the Justice 40 effort, which is sort of a whole of government effort to look at where funding for climate resilience is going and to require agencies to do better accounting of where that funding is received and to move it towards historically marginalized communities. So I think it's, I'm not saying the solution is present. This is a systematic transformation that will take time. But I think, the funding goes in to do new projects. How those projects get implemented, where and by what processes is what also needs to sort of, change over time. So we have to look at sort of both sides of this, the funding and the process. So I'll drop a link to Justice 40 so folks can see that.
Yeah, great. And I think that is a good opportunity since agencies have to show how they're, working with benefiting impacted communities, in environmental justice communities, and also the New York State legislation, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the Community Leadership and Climate Protection Act. I get that mixed up sometimes, but basically that a certain amount and the implementation of that, which is being advocated right now, that a percentage of the investments needs to go to communities that are most impacted by climate change, to have them, at the table and part of the process, not just beneficiaries passively. So I think on the state level, that legislation and getting the implementation done is important. Anyone want to? I think the silo problem, is a real challenge, particularly with the federal government, but many agencies. It's interesting when you have a flood protection project that's funded by HUD, CDGB, and FEMA, and if you have the two and they have their overlapping requirement. I know in the case of Red Hook, the city decided to reprogram its HUD money and just have one agency funding the thing and then have the city match it, to not create the overlap of two agency requirements, which gets very complicated. But at the end of the day, communities are on the receiving end of the good and the bad. Anyone want to share anything? I know we have to wrap up, I think, in a few minutes. So maybe I invite people who want to give some closing thoughts and ideas that they might have coming from these presentations and our discussion. And should we start? We could start in an order. We could go by the same order that we came in on. So Roger.
Thanks, Dan. Listen, I think any discussion regarding coastal flooding and the effects that it can have on people and property and neighborhoods and cities is important to continue, no matter what. It affects so many people in so many different ways that it's a conversation and a dialogue that has to continue from now until it's never going to be solved, but it can certainly, some of it can be remedied.
Okay, Lindsay.
I guess I'll just say that we all sort of know the power of storyline to frame an argument, whether it's a politician or in the media. We know that stories get used to motivate or justify decision making, but whose stories get told, who owns that narrative, and how can we sort of lift up some of the stories that don't always get told, particularly in historically marginalized or vulnerable communities. And I think thinking of those stories as a data stream alongside some of these other maps and outputs that we've seen is really one important way forward.
Right. Drew?
So yeah, this work and this discussions is one of the most important things that we need to be doing right now. We know with the climate crisis, flooding is going to get worse and all types of flooding. And again, just to reiterate what I said earlier, we need to make sure that those most impacted are at the table and are helping to frame the solutions too. The community is the expert.
Right. And Rebecca?
Yeah, just to reiterate what everyone said, it's so important for communities, governments, and researchers to work together to kind of provide a suite of data, information, and adaptations so that folks in these communities can start improving their quality of lives and prepare for bigger impacts in the future.
Well, I just want to thank all of you. I think this is a great discussion, and it's very exhilarating actually to speak across silos, across water bodies, to actually communicate with folks that you don't always talk to, because we're very focused on our own areas, be it sectors or geographic areas. So this is great, and I encourage everyone to go to the community board and continue the conversation on that board. And thank you all for your participation. And I'll hand it off to Rob.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan, and the rest of the panel for a great conversation. A lot of great issues, a lot of great follow-up work, and hopefully something that we as HEP and working with all of you can take on as we look forward to both the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill going into law. Just a reminder, as Dan mentioned, we do have a community board, so if folks have additional thoughts, please, you can start a conversation there. For the rest of the day, we have two more panels coming up. One at 2 p.m., we have a bystander training, part of our commitment to making public spaces welcoming to all, and that's at 2 p.m. And at 4 p.m., we're going to be diving into the question of how and where we can create safe swimming opportunities in the Hudson and Harbor, and how to communicate about risk on that. So please join us today, and again, the conference the rest of the week. And thanks again to the panelists and participants.
Great.